I am delighted to have been given the opportunity to introduce our first plenary speaker, Professor Michael Reiss. Michael is Professor of Science Education at the Institute of Education, University College London. He is also visiting professor at the Universities of Kiel, York, and the Royal Veterinary College. He's Honorary Fellow of the British Science Association and of the College of Teachers. He's docent at the University of Helsinki and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. So quite a lineup there. His research is in science education, focuses on sex education, curriculum studies, and bioethics. He's published and edited numerous books, and I can't really do justice here, but just to give you a flavour. In 2000, he published a book based on an amazing 5-year longitudinal study of science lessons called Understanding Science Lessons, 5 years of science teaching. Then in 2003, with J.M. Halstead, he then published a book, Values in Sex Education from Principles to Practice, linked to his research interests. Later on, he then edited a book with Lang and Bond, not looking inside the science classroom, but learning outside the classroom. And most recently, in 2017, he's edited a book with Ian Abrahams, Enhancing Learning with Effective Practical Science. So there's a broad brush of interest here that Michael brings to science education. And I hope that just captures it. You can look at all of his books. Of course, he's published in numerous articles in science education journals and has supervised 45 students in their successful completion of PhDs and EdDs. So amazingly diverse background in science education. But finally, because we've had to share some interesting facts, just a couple of interesting facts about Michael, just to confirm just what a polymath Michael really is. He's also a priest in the Church of England. He's worked as a psychodynamic counsellor for 10 years. And rather intriguingly, and you can all look this up, he has a piece of artwork in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I've actually had a look at that piece of art, Michael, with colleagues from Queen Mary University in London. So, given his incredibly rich and diverse background and his evident success in supervising successfully so many doctoral students, I feel he is absolutely the ideal person to deliver this first plenary lecture. What kind of researcher do you want to be? Over to Michael.
Well, I want to start by saying, Anne, that is a most wonderfully generous introduction. I think possibly the nicest introduction I've ever had. So thank you very much indeed. I would also like really to say a huge thank you, not only to Anne, but also to Deb, Liam, and many others who've done all the vast amounts of organisation for this conference to be possible. And it's great to have a conference organised both by Oxford University and Oxford Brookes University. Most of you, of course, I do not know. There are colleagues, science education colleagues, who have been in the field a long time. Obviously hoping this session ends up of being value to everybody.
Michael, you've muted yourself.
Great. I think that's got it sorted out again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Now, the next relevant question is, can you actually see the first slide? What sort of researcher do you want to be on the PowerPoint? Good. So what I want to do is to spend about 30 to 40 minutes, because then that will give us about 10 to 15 minutes using the chat function for discussion and questions. I want to spend about 30 to 40 minutes on the topic which you may have read about anyway as the title of my talk in the program: what sort of researcher, what type of researcher do you want to be? About the only thing Anne didn't say about me was my own PhD and postdoc, so I thought I'd start about those because they represent one very particular way of doing research. My doctorate and the one-year postdoctorate I had immediately afterwards was absolutely pure science. It was pure biology, it was evolutionary biology, and population genetics. And in fact, when I started it, that suited me as a person, because I was a very nerdy schoolboy in the sense that I was very interested in certain subjects and not interested in all sorts of other things in life. I gradually broadened out over the next 10 or 20 years. And I was extremely keen on mathematics and physics. But I was very, very fortunate because my PhD ended up being on the behavior of red deer. And I'm hoping you can see in front of you now a picture of a female red deer and her calf. And these animals, which are beautiful, beautiful animals, are on the island of Rum, R-U-M, which is on the west coast of Scotland. And I started my PhD very young. I was still only 20 years old, and I'd been born and brought up and educated in London. And apart from going to Cambridge University, I'd hardly ever gone further north in the United Kingdom than Yorkshire, which is only about a quarter of the way up. And I'd never been to Scotland. And I suddenly found myself doing a PhD in this beautiful, beautiful part of the world. Now, I could, of course, spend far too long telling you about the PhD, but I won't. This is a second picture. These are two male red deer fighting. They clash antlers. The antlers come into contact in the autumn, round about September, and that's because the dominant, the successful deer, end up getting access to the females, and they end up controlling a successful deer, a little group of maybe between 3 and 8 females. And as you may or may not be able to see, the male at the front of the slide wearing the antlers is in fact larger than the females. The typical adult male weighs about 1.6 times as much as the typical adult female. And my PhD was about why is that difference between male body mass and female body mass about 1.6. So it's pure biology. To be honest, nobody has ever made the slightest use of my research. If by use you mean something to help people or animals, it was intrinsically incredibly interesting, and I'm very glad I did it, but it probably wouldn't totally satisfy me now. I have become a slightly different person. And what I want to do, of course, now is to get you to think a bit more about what sort of research you are undertaking and what sort of researcher do you want to be. Now, in terms of what sort of research you are undertaking, the conventional way to think about this at the beginning of research methods courses in doctoral training is a rather crude, naive comparison between things like quantitative and qualitative research, or whether you're using mixed methods. But a slightly more, I think, helpful way of looking at this in terms of who you are as a science education researcher is to think about whether you're doing what I was doing in my PhD, which is the next bullet point, which is simply trying to understand an issue. This is a very valuable thing to do in science education. But another possibility is actually during the doctorate itself to try and improve the situation. So one might try and devise, for example, a new set of teaching materials, or a new curriculum which you trial, or a new approach to assessment. And then finally, my last bullet point on this slide, and these are not, of course, discrete options, they can overlap, is you might want to do something which allows you better to understand yourself as a result of the doctorate. Now, sadly, people don't give doctorates just because you've better understood yourself. So that needs to tie in with the actual work you're doing during the doctorate. But I'll explain a bit more about how that can happen. And I thought the most useful thing to do now was just to spend about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes in my telling you about each of 3 different of my recent doctoral students, because they each did a different sort of research. And the first one is a wonderful woman called Tuba Gokpinar, obviously now Dr. Tuba Gokpinar. And the first bullet point shows you the title of her PhD thesis, the significance of outside school factors in science education, the role of families on the attitudes that Turkish children in London have to science. In fact, she did a bit of comparative work with Turkish children back in Turkey, but that was only a supplementary part of the study. Now, some of you may know that the name Tuba Gokpinar is indeed a not uncommon name in Turkish, and Tuba was of Turkish extraction, but was now living with her husband in London, and indeed has now got 2 children. Though when she started the doctorate with me, she was a Turkish citizen. And what she was interested in was student attitudes and aspirations. Now, as some of you will know, within science education, the whole area of student aspirations, in other words, what students want to do after they've left school, and in particular, whether or not they continue with science, has become quite strongly dominated by the work of the French sociologist Bourdieu. And this is not now going to turn into a lecture about Bourdieu, but he had 3 central concepts: habitus, field, and capital, and particularly through the work of Louise Archer and her colleagues in a series of projects with the overall acronym ASPIRES. The work of Louise has led to this notion of science capital. So very briefly, Louise has argued for a number of years that those of us, and it probably is many of us here at this conference, who have retained a deep interest in science since our school days, probably have quite a lot of science capital. That is a sort of baggage that we carry around with us, supported by our parents, our teachers. Maybe we were well taught at school. Maybe our parents watched science programs on television. Maybe they took us to science museums. Some of us may even have been given as presents items of science equipment, whether something quite simple and small or something as impressive as a chemistry kit or a microscope. Now, in about the 3rd or 4th supervision that I had with Tuba, she came into the supervision and told me that she had been thinking, which is always rather encouraging for a doctoral supervisor. And she started telling me about how she thought that the work on Bourdieu was not enough, that it needed to be combined with the work of Sen and his capability approach. Now, fortunately, I'd heard of Amartya Sen, a brilliant economist, an Indian who'd won the Nobel Prize, and he had a rather unusual approach to economics, that he was far more interested in human flourishing and human potential than he was in mathematical models. And very briefly, what Tuba did was to propose a model where the role of outside school factors, by which she meant things like families, was twofold. First, in providing an initial set of science-related resources. That's the habitus, the cultural and the social capital in the field of Bourdieu. and then drawing on Sen, converting these resources to science-related capabilities. And her model also highlights the distinction between science-related functionings, which are the outcomes which eventually individuals achieve, and their capabilities. And I can't, of course, go into her work in much detail, but she had some lovely in-depth qualitative work with children who often had excellent science capabilities, so they were able to continue with science if they'd wanted to, but they just chose not to. And Tuba argued, and I agree with her, that this goes beyond the standard work in the science capital field, which to some extent is a bit like a pipeline approach and doesn't give an enormous amount of scope to people's autonomy in deciding whether they continue with science or not. And then the last slide for Tuba was that she tested her model with an account of Turkish immigrant students' science-related capabilities and looked at the role of their families in particular in forming and extending these capabilities. And she used a fairly traditional mixed methods approach. She did interviews with students, she did interviews with parents, she had questionnaires for students, and she watched lessons to provide an analysis of how these family factors influence the students' attitudes, aspirations, and attainment in science. So Tuba's work illustrates the first of those three sorts of research. She wanted to understand something. Now, she came to it with a commitment to justice. She was Turkish herself and indeed was an immigrant. So she was interested in understanding, but her own work didn't try to change something. And I want to go on to now to another of my doctoral students, Seth Ayman, now Dr. Seth Ayman from Malaysia. So the title of his PhD is Improving Pedagogical Practices of Teaching Inquiry in Primary Science in Malaysia, a Classroom Action Research Study. And I want to read you the extremely unusual first part of the abstract of his PhD. And the abstract of his PhD begins as follows. As Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the classic tale of a girl who disappears down a rabbit hole to a fantastic place full of bizarre adventures, that is how I situated myself in this unique piece of writing. As a novice teacher, I am getting curiouser and curiouser, which is a phrase from Alice in Wonderland, about my own pedagogical practices. Therefore, I have decided to put myself forward in the dual role of a teacher-researcher to study how I can improve my own pedagogical practices in implementing the teaching of inquiry in a high-performing primary school in Malaysia. So Seth came over to the United Kingdom. He was already a qualified primary teacher of science. He was young, so he hadn't done much teaching, which is why he modestly refers to himself as a novice teacher. And then after a year at the Institute of Education in London, he then went back to Malaysia and spent roughly 3 months or so teaching. And he taught a program that he had devised, which was meant to encourage more inquiry-based learning. Because Seth explained to me that in Malaysia, as in many countries in the world, the tradition for most primary and indeed secondary science teaching is not to give much choice to the learner, but for it to be taught in a fairly didactic manner, and certainly with rather little practical work, and what practical work there is, normally being mainly demonstrations by the teachers, or occasionally very simple practicals where you just follow a recipe. And I don't want to lose the Alice in Wonderland theme. Every chapter in his PhD, he began with a copy of one of the original illustrations when the book was published in the 19th century and a quotation from it. And as a few of you may know, Alice in Wonderland was actually written by an academic in Oxford, so it's fairly appropriate for this ESERA summer school. And I just thought I'd show you a few screen grabs from Seth's thesis to give you an example of his sort of research. He started off, before he got back into the classroom, of doing a careful analysis of the textbooks that are used in Malaysia in primary science teaching. And what he concluded, which he pretty well knew already, is that while they have a lot of good features about them, in particular, they're very clear, they're well produced, they don't have too much information on each page, they're nicely laid out, they present a model of science as if science is simply about receiving what we know. So Sibel, when she was introducing herself earlier on, talked about her interest in the nature of science. And this was something that Seth himself shared. He was interested in how learners understand what science is. And the way that most pupils in primary schools in Malaysia is to see science as a very powerful body of information and a single method for building up that information. And he wanted to help them introduce themselves to a richer conceptualization of science. Now, one nice feature, by the way, of his PhD is that for ethical reasons, he decided he didn't want to use actual photographs of any of the students in his class. Although they would have been happy for him to have done so, it's quite difficult for 10 and 11-year-old students to not give permission to their teacher. So what he thought instead was he would use video, and indeed he videoed, I forget how many lessons, but about 15 or so lessons that he taught with 2 different videos. But then he used some rather nice software you can get nowadays, which takes particular stills you want from the video and turns them into these simple line drawings that you can see. And the advantage is that the software is good at preserving both gestures, as you can see from this student, and facial and body expressions, but it doesn't allow anybody to identify the student. So this is, and these are pseudonyms, and in fact he decided to use English names rather than Malaysian names for the pseudonyms. This is Diana's expression after she was asked by Seth as a researcher, do you like to use the textbook? And Diana is replying, no. It bores me. And indeed, almost the instinctive movement that Diana makes is much the same as I would do, as you can probably see, if I say, no, it bores me. What Seth then did is, for those of you who have been reared within a tradition of inquiry work, what many of you will be very familiar with, a lot of group work, a lot of time for students to talk together, to plan what they're going to do, to decide collectively on how they're going to record their results and what their results are, so that they're getting a better idea of a community of young scientists working together. And then he had some nice, quite simple, but open-ended investigative work. So some of you may not know the egg drop challenge, but you can probably guess what it is, both from its name and from this photograph. Again, students work in groups, and you give each group one egg, though if you're nice, you allow them to have a second egg if they break the first egg. And they also have access to a certain amount of packaging, and their job is to find the maximum height from which the egg can be dropped in a package without the egg smashing. Now, if you're not careful, of course, primary children can spend hours doing this and learn absolutely no science whatsoever. The science is all to do with acceleration and deceleration and forces and pressure. Because without going into a lecture to you about elementary physics, what determines whether or not an egg drops is largely to do with its rate of deceleration when it comes in contact with the ground. And that's what you can change by using packaging. Now, what Seth was doing, therefore, is he was researching an intervention, but it was an intervention where Seth was hoping that it would make a difference. He wants to improve primary science teaching in Malaysia and elsewhere. And I don't think Seth is yet sure whether he's going to spend most of his career back in Malaysia or not. In fact, what happened was after his PhD, he went back to Malaysia, but then quite soon he got a postdoc in Dundee in Scotland, so he moved to Scotland. Now, the issues he's looking at, primary science education, are ones that apply around the world, so it'll be interesting to see where he ends up. Now, I want to give you my third and final example, a very different student, Joy Silverman, now, of course, Dr. Joy Silverman. She got her PhD in 2019, as did Seth. Tuba got hers in 2018. Joy had worked for many, many years as a mathematics teacher in London. And in fact, because I'm a science educator, I was not her main supervisor. I came on board as her second supervisor, and her main supervisor, who carried on, was a mathematics education specialist. The title of Joy's thesis is An Exploration of Unconscious Operations and Group Mentalities in Mathematics Lessons in a Secondary State School in England. Now, in the exhaustive introduction that Anne rather generously gave me, she mentioned that at one point I worked, in fact, for about 10 years part-time, as a psychodynamic counsellor. And without going to that into real detail, what it does is it uses the framework derived from traditional psychoanalysis in a psychotherapeutic way to try and help people who have had issues to do with relationships. So, for example, they might be feeling depressed, or they might feel that all their relationships go horribly wrong, or they find themselves repeating situations where other people always take advantage of them in the relationship. And if you think about it, school teaching is very largely about the relationships that a teacher has with her or his students in class. Now, I'm just going to now quote you a bit from the abstract of Joy's PhD, which is a more conventional abstract than Seth's was. There's no mention here of rabbits or Alice in Wonderland. This study employs an object relations psychoanalytic framework. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into some lecture about what's meant by object relations, but it's to do with relationships between different people. To examine occurrence of unpredictable and disruptive episodes in mathematics lessons involving a sample of pupils aged 12 to 16 with a broad range of mathematical attainment and socio-cultural backgrounds. Now, can I emphasize part of my admiration for Joy here? What she's looking at, therefore, is times when the lessons went wrong. Unpredictable and disruptive episodes. So Joy's an experienced teacher. Much of her teaching time, of course, things go fine. But as almost every teacher finds, sometimes there are occasions when they don't go fine. And she wondered whether a psychoanalytical object relations informed study would help her better understand what was going on. And she collected data over 3 years by participant observation. In other words, she was still working as a conventional teacher, rather like Seth was working as a teacher. She didn't have videos. What she did was she got into the habit of making very high quality notes immediately after lessons. So this is something which, if you're trained as a clinician in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or psychodynamic counseling, you get used to doing. And you get quite good. You don't always remember things verbatim, of course you don't, but you remember them to a high degree of accuracy. That's a bit more of technicality, but what I really want to mention, it's the last bit of her abstract of her thesis, is the phrase at the end, are presented in a format informed by autoethnography. Now, autoethnography is not widely used in science education doctoral studies, but what it is an approach which is in a sense an extension of action research. Action research, which Seth used, is all about trying something out, evaluating it, modifying the approach, and trying it out again. And you go through these successive cycles. Joy didn't really go through cycles. It's not real action research. But what she did was to use the approach of autoethnography, where a large part of the focus is very much on the person undertaking the study themselves. Now, let me read you a rather long quotation which came from a year 8 lesson. So that's when the students are 12 to 13 years old. And it came when the head of year 8, so that's the teacher responsible for the pastoral care of all of the students in year 8, which is probably a total of about 150 or so in the school, came and watched her lesson for half an hour. And these are the field notes that Joy wrote after the lesson, and they're meant to be representing what the head of year 8 said. Well, I can certainly see that you are having problems with Jake, or should I say, he is having problems with you. I was watching his face as he walked up to the board to write the answer to the starter. That's the initial problem. And then I watched him when you refused to let him answer any more questions. Man, he looked like he was going to kill you. Later on, as you saw, I sat next to him while he was working in his book, and we had a chat, which was mostly about you. Jake told me he hates maths because you always cut him off. You never really let him have his say. Look, you don't have to remind me. He can be a real nightmare. But this was how he sees you, and actually, I got his point. This is what he said. Mrs. S, she's never fair. First she tells me I've got to do these things, and then she tells me to shut up. She never really listens to me, and look what I do for her. From where I was sitting, that was somewhat true. I know you have 28 pupils in the class, but maybe you can work on your relationship a bit. Now, don't get mad at me, but I think there's a need for some improvement there. Now, let me just make a few brief comments about that. First of all, what we have got is Joy's writing down after this was said to her by the head of year 8. So we don't have an audio tape, so it's not an exact transcription, but I suspect it's quite a good, faithful, accurate account of what the head of year 8 said to her. Though the fact that it won't be perfect is something in analysis Joy tried to consider herself. And what we've got going on is very, very interesting. I can't go again into real depth here, but we've got, haven't we? We've got here basically where a teacher has come into one of his colleagues' lessons for half an hour and has basically become convinced by one student's account of what always happens in these lessons. So there are intellectually interesting questions here for why did Jake succeed in convincing his head of year 8 that what he said was close to reality? Why is Joy somebody for whom a colleague ends up speaking as this colleague, the head of year 8, has done? And is it realistic for us to try to get to grips with what was really going on in the classroom? Or is the best that we can do to try and work out what Jake thought was going on, what the head of year 8 thought was going on, and what Joy thought was going on? And I'll just give you one other extract from Joy's PhD. This is very different. This is Joy writing after a lesson with year 11 students. So that's 15 to 16-year-olds. The class worked intently and relatively silently after that. When the bell rang, several pupils surrounded Renata and carried her away into the corridor. That's rhetorical speak. What had happened was that Renata, one of the pupils, had told the class at the very beginning that there'd been a fire at her home. And although it turned out that nobody was ill, nobody had been hurt, they were now the family having to live somewhere else. So that completely dominated the first 5 to 10 minutes of the lesson. And then the normal lesson went on and was a normal lesson. Everyone else said goodbye and hurried to their next classes in another part of the school. But Tom lingered behind and looked at me. "Can I come to your room sometimes to play your board games?" he asked. Board games are things like chess and drafts. This is back to what Joy writes. "I kept them for a year 7, that's 11 to 12-year-olds, lunchtime group that met in my room every Wednesday. But I said to Tom, yes." After a moment's pause, he asked me if he could keep some of his books in my room. I suddenly felt the situation had become dangerous. We stared at each other, and I told him that would not be a good idea. We kept staring at each other, and then he said, "I might stop by sometimes," before darting out the door. Now, what happened in this episode is that initially, Joy thought that Tom was treating her rather like a mother figure, which is not at all unusual for male students with female teachers, especially when female teachers are older than the pupils. So Tom is asking, can I come and play the board games, which Tom, being a year 11, would know were for 11 to 12-year-olds, year 7. But then, of course, Joy starts realizing he's not seeing me as a mother figure, he's seeing me as a possible sexual partner. I suddenly felt the situation had become dangerous. He doesn't just want to come to the year 7 lunchtime groups, he wants an excuse to come more often. Tom is asking Joy, can he keep some of his books in her room? And she goes, in a way, by the way, that I think is absolutely right as a teacher, she goes into teacher mode. That would not be a good idea. But Tom tries to keep the door open. I might stop by sometimes. Now, in most schools, in my experience, anybody who's taught for a number of years, whether male or female, finds some occasions when they're treated as a parental figure by students, a father figure or a mother figure, and some occasions when adolescents try and start seeing them as a sexual figure, which is hardly surprising, because in a secondary school, teachers are teaching somewhere between often 100, 200 students every couple of weeks or so, aged between 11, 12 and 15, 16, sometimes 17, 18, depending on the school. But the point I'm making in terms of research methodology is that Joy wanted not only to understand what was going on in the minds of Tom, the head of year 8, and Jake, but what was going on for herself. So she was trying to understand the relationships in a classroom, and she was trying to understand herself as a person. And now this is the last slide I've got, and this is in a sense something I'd like you to reflect on now for a few minutes. And then after a minute or 2 or 3, begin to start to use the chat function and either try answering one of these questions, which I will pick up on, or ask me a question related to the presentation I've just given. And the sort of questions I'm suggesting you might like to think about are, why are you undertaking a PhD? What sort of researcher do you want to be? What sort of person? What sort of person do you want to be? And how can the work that you do reflect your values and your identity? Okay, so I suspect at some point, actually, let me ask you a question for somebody who's got their video on. Can you still see those questions or not?
Michael, they've gone off slightly.
Right, that's because I minimized them. So what I'll do is I'll leave them on there for a minute or two more, but then I think I need to remove them so I can see the chat function.
Yeah.
So I'll keep quiet. I'll leave them there for just a minute or two, and then they'll be taken away and I'll start seeing what's in the chat function, or one of the presenters will kindly email me some of them.
Are you happy to see the chat? There are a couple of questions in the chat, and Alison's going to email some of them to me. Do you want to handle that, Michael?
I've got the chat in front of me, so
Yeah,
that's probably going to be fine, actually.
Yeah.
So let me just try and pick one. In fact, it's simply the first one, and it's a very good question from Heba. What advice would I have for somebody like me who wants to be a multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary researcher? Thank you. So the people who know me well know my sense of humor. So my instinctive humorous reply is, well, Heba, this is a great way you will have to develop a split personality. Because if you're really going to be a multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary researcher, you will be able to do everything from understand issues, improve performance in a classroom or wherever you're working, a museum, a field center, and understand yourself better. But the more serious answer I'd give is that cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary work is great. Two bits of advice, one of which is check if the disciplines really can be brought together. Are they compatible? It's quite difficult to work when the disciplines one wants to bring together are incompatible. And if you're going to bring them together, get interested both in where they neatly fit together and in the points of tension. And then as a researcher, you'll probably find in yourself, are you somebody who's more interested in harmony, bringing everything together into a whole? Are you somebody who wants the world to be a place where everybody likes each other? Or are you somebody who's more interested in where the different disciplines rub up against each other and don't quite fit? Are you somebody who's more interested in points of tension, which can, of course, sometimes be a very creative way of building new knowledge? Right, I'll try and pick up another one. Now, this is from Jessie. What advice do I have for someone with a PhD in natural sciences who's now pursuing postdoctoral research in science education and wants to continue in the field? Well, of course, Jessie, I'm totally biased because, as you know, I have a PhD in the natural sciences. And although I didn't technically do a postdoc in science education, after I taught in schools for a while, I got back into science education. So the advice, I suppose, if I try and give a succinct but honest answer, is draw on your expertise. Now, I'm not, there isn't time to go into a question and answer session. So let's just, for example, assume you've got a PhD in astrophysics. So you are going to know more about astrophysics than about 99.9% of science educators. And if I was going to give you advice purely for your career, unless you have got so sick of astrophysics that you can't bear the thought of ever working it again, start doing some sort of research, if you're not already, rapidly about astrophysics education. You can do things quite quickly. So, for example, find out what are the leading textbooks in the country where you live or work for teaching physics to, let's say, upper high school, 16, 17-year-olds, and do a discourse analysis of how astrophysics is presented. You might do it in terms of the accuracy of the information. You might do it in terms of the assumptions. So just to give one further suggestion, for example, is astrophysics presented purely from the point of view of us learning about the stars and other distant objects, or does it connect with astrobiology, the possibility there might be life in other places? Does it connect with thoughts about might humans ever travel to these sorts of places? In other words, draw on your expertise and get a publication out pretty quickly where people start thinking, wow, Jessie, yes, she's the one who does work in astrophysics education.
Michael,
Okay.
can I just put a
Yes.
question to you that came
Do.
up a little bit earlier, because some of the ones
I know.
of chat. There was one question when you were talking about Gokpinar's research. What improvements has the application of Gokpinar model had in science classes in secondary?
So the honest answer is not much yet. Give her a chance. She only finished her PhD 2 years ago. So the way that science education research works is you have to work in it for a long, long time to affect change, being honest.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that at all. That's the case for virtually every field of research. Now, you know, most of us, as you heard from the introduction, who work in science education, so whether it's, you know, Anne, Deb, Sibel, myself, etc., Judith, we all have our fields, and sometimes we have successive doctoral students who work in an area which we hope will collectively build up and improve. So I don't want to embarrass anyone in particular, but Sibel's work in argumentation, which of course she hasn't done on her own. She's done it with people like Jonathan Osborne. She's done it with Shirley, Simon, and others. Collectively, that has led to many of us in the field realizing much more the importance of high quality discussion, argument in the true sense of the term, in the classroom. And so when we help work with the next generation to be teachers in initial teacher education, and when we run workshops, we hope that shifts the discipline. And in the same way, I would hope, given time, Tuber's work will build on the work that Louise Archer and others have done in Science Capital and help give us a better understanding and improve the way in which people who want to continue with science can be encouraged to. But briefly, one of the nice things about Tuber's work is it stops people thinking that it's a bit of a failure if able young people don't continue with science education. Tuber's got examples of students who would have been perfectly capable of continuing with science education, who like science, who enjoyed it, who were well taught, but want to do something different. Now, Anne, do you want to pick up another question?
So, you know what, this is a very quick one. It's about the software that Seth used for capturing that wonderful image. Do you know the name of it? A couple of questions on that.
The answer is no, but of course, all doctorates now are online available. So if you look up AIMAN, Seth, oh, he's got a very long name, but AIMAN, UCL, Institute of Education, it'll be in there. And if the worst comes to worst, email me and I'll find out.
Yeah.
Now,
and those are the ones.
Yep.
I'd allow you to pick up one more question, Michael,
yes.
And then we'll draw it to a close
I was going to say
on the end of the chat. Yeah.
Oh, this is very good from Katerina.
Yeah.
If our goal is to contribute to change, how shall we negotiate our already vulnerable positions as PhD students? If being in between disciplines, that even adds the difficulty of finding one's position in the field. So I am absolutely with you, Katerina, that somebody doing a PhD student is in a vulnerable position in one sense. Point taken entirely. It's vulnerable in a number of ways, as you probably know rather better than I do. But one of the ways ultimately to succeed is, first of all, to get the PhD or EdD or whatever sort of doctorate it is, and then secondly, to start publishing from it. And there is a dearth, there is a shortage of work in science education which connects who the researcher is with the work that they do. So for example, some of you, but many of you won't, some of you will have heard of a journal called Cultural Studies in Science Education. Have a look at that, which is very interested in the effect of culture. I seem to be doing quite a good advertisement for Sibel at the moment. One of the other hats Sibel wears is she's the chief editor of one of the sort of 5 or 6 leading journals in science education, Science and Education. And one of the good things about that journal is it has an explicit focus not only on history and philosophy of science, but on issues that connect with the sort of science education that is being taught and the sort of research that's being done. And it might be possible, even as a vulnerable doctoral student, to have a reflective piece on one's work sent to a journal like either Cultural Studies in Science Education or Science Education. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think we stop there. So it's just my job to thank all of you for listening and participating, and for all your questions, which are questions which can be pursued throughout the weeks if they weren't answered here. But the biggest thank you to Michael, because in the talk that he's just given us, he's not only answered the question, what kind of researcher do you want to be? He's covered so many issues and challenges in doing doctoral research, from the purpose, the focus, how to communicate effectively, theoretical frameworks, ethics, data collection methods. So he's covered such a broad brush of issues in such an interesting way by drawing on the richness and diversity of his own experience as supervising students. So those cases, and your own research indeed, Michael, were fascinating. At this stage, I think we can all put a hand clap to Michael from our reaction. Thank you very much. An unusual way of doing it, but that was absolutely brilliant. And thank you, and hope the rest of the week goes well. I'm just going to hand back to Deb in case there's anything that she wants to say to you all before we close. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, can I just reiterate the thanks as well, Michael? It was just absolutely fascinating. I was listening to that very avidly, and I could relate it to a number of different PhD students that I've supervised over the years, and it is really fascinating to think about how it changes them as people, as well as their intention to change what's happening around them as well. So it was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.